They said he couldn't save everyone. That rule had cost him a marriage, friends, and peace. But when Jack found a German shepherd crying beside his dead handler, he broke that rule one last time. What followed wasn't rescue, it was redemption. A story of sacrifice, silence, and a bond no law could break. Like this video, subscribe and tell us what would you risk to save one loyal soul. The snow had begun to fall long before sunset, soft flakes turning the mountains of Montana into a quiet, white wilderness. Inside a small log cabin perched above a frozen valley, Jack Dawson sat alone by the crackling wood stove. His calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee gone cold. He watched the fire as if it were a living thing, each snap of wood echoing through the stillness like a distant gunshot. He didn't flinch, but his eyes, gray and tired, held the reflex of a man who had once lived too close to noise. The walls were lined with faded photographs, his wife Marianne smiling under summer light. His son Tyler in his graduation cap, his arm awkwardly draped over Jack's shoulder. They hadn't spoken in 2 years. The last conversation ended with Tyler shouting, "You were a soldier, not a father." Those words still hung somewhere in this cabin, heavier than the smell of pine or gun oil. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the old ache travel down to his spine. Some nights the pain was worse, ghost pain, his VA doctor called it. But it wasn't the body that hurt most. It was the silence. He could stand the cold, the isolation, even the storms that cut him off from town for days. What he couldn't stand was how loud the quiet had become since Marianne died. He'd buried her under an aspen tree behind the house where she used to hang wind chimes. The chimes still rang sometimes when the wind moved just right. Tonight they were still. The blizzard came down harder, beating against the window panes. Jack adjusted the lamp on the table, took a sip of bitter coffee, and stared out at the falling white. He told himself to go to bed, but he couldn't. Sleep was dangerous ground. It was where the war waited. Dust, gunfire, the smell of diesel and blood, the faces he couldn't save. He still woke some nights calling out names, though none of them were around to answer. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like something wounded. Jack frowned. He knew this mountain better than most. He knew the sound of the wind, of foxes, of elk moving through the snow. This was none of those. It was sharper, shorter. A cry. Maybe a coyote, maybe a deer, but then it came again, higher, broken, the kind of sound that punched through armor and memory all at once. Jack's chest tightened. He stood, set down his mug, and reached for his coat hanging by the door, an old army field jacket, the same one he'd worn through his second tour in Afghanistan. The patches had long faded, but he could still make out the outline of his name. He hesitated, hand on the doorknob. "Don't be stupid," he muttered to himself. It was 20 degrees below visibility, almost gone. Whatever's out there, it's nature's problem. But then the sound came again, soft, pleading. A cry that wasn't just noise. It was desperation. And for a man who had once dragged wounded brothers through dust and blood, ignoring a cry was impossible. Jack grabbed his flashlight, shoved his boots on, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall. The wind tore at his face, and within seconds, snow was seeping into the seams of his gloves. The beam of light cut through the storm in short, useless bursts. "Jesus!" he muttered, squinting into the white. His breath came out in quick clouds that vanished instantly. He followed the sound, one crunching step at a time. The cry grew louder. It was close now, just beyond the pines. Jack's boots sank deep into the drifts. He stumbled once, caught himself on a tree trunk, heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of fear and focus. He hadn't felt this alive, this needed in years. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakably a dog. Not a wild one either. The pitch was different. It was pain. Jack knelt, brushed snow away with his glove. And there, beneath a half-buried log, something moved. A shape dark against the white. He lowered the flashlight, and the beam caught the glint of eyes, deep brown, wide, terrified. "Hey," he said softly, voice instinctively calm, the same tone he used to speak to wounded soldiers. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The animal didn't move. The fur was matted with ice and streaks of dark red. Jack's breath caught when the light shifted and revealed what lay beside it. A human arm, blue, with cold sleeve torn the glint of a metal badge near the wrist. Jack's gut clenched. Oh God. He moved closer, brushing more snow away until the shape of a man appeared. Uniform police issue Montana state patch, barely visible under frost. The man's face was pale, frozen eyes half open, as if mid-command. His hand still gripped the leash that connected him to the German shepherd. The dog gave a weak growl, then whimpered, pressing its nose to the man's still hand. It tried to lick him awake. Jack felt something crack deep inside, a place he thought had turned to stone long ago. "You're loyal," he whispered, voice thick. "Too damn loyal." The dog whined again, a faint sound that barely rose above the wind. Jack reached out slow and deliberate. The dog flinched, baring teeth in fear. Jack didn't pull back. He just knelt there in the storm hand, extended eyes steady. "At ease, soldier," he said softly, almost instinctively. The phrase came out of muscle memory, the same words he used on patrol when his men were panicking. The dog froze the growl, fading into a soft, confused whimper. Jack took another breath. "That's it. Easy, boy." The shepherd's head sagged against the snow. Jack could feel the tremor of its ribs under his palm. He looked at the dead officer again, the man's face, the badge half buried in snow. "R. Miller," he read aloud. "You did your job, officer." He reached down, unclipped the leash, and gathered the trembling dog into his arms. It was heavier than he expected, the limp weight of something that had fought too hard for too long. "Hang on," he murmured, pulling his jacket tighter around it. "Let's get you out of here." The trek back was brutal. The wind had grown teeth, and Jack could barely see 10 feet ahead. Twice he stumbled, once falling to his knees, clutching the animal tighter. The dog's breathing was faint, but there. Every step felt like a mile. But something pushed him forward, a purpose he hadn't felt since the day they shipped him home in a metal bird filled with flag-covered coffins. When he finally reached the cabin, his hands were numb, his body trembling with exhaustion. He kicked the door shut behind him, lowered the shepherd onto a blanket by the stove, and built the fire higher until the room glowed orange. The dog stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open for a second before closing again. "You're safe now," Jack whispered. The words came out rough, but they filled the air like a promise. Outside, the wind screamed through the mountains, but inside there was warmth. Jack leaned back against the wall chest, heaving, and for the first time in years he didn't feel completely alone. The storm didn't ease, but Jack didn't care. The world outside was a blur of white fury, the kind that swallowed sound and reason, but he had the dog in his arms now, a German shepherd, heavy limp, but still breathing. He could feel the faint flutter of its chest against his own, a fragile rhythm that reminded him of the way his men had sounded when they were barely hanging on after a firefight. His boots crunched through the drifts, snow slapping against his legs, wind clawing at his face, and all he could think was that this animal had stayed with its partner until the end. That kind of loyalty didn't die easily. Inside the cabin, he placed the dog near the fire again, this time spreading the wool blanket flatter, moving with care and precision like he used to in field triage. The shepherd's fur was stiff with ice, and blood its paws cracked from the cold. Jack poured a bit of warm water into a bowl and set it nearby, then crouched low, speaking softly. "Come on, buddy. Drink a little." The dog didn't move. Its eyes flickered open, brown, glazed with exhaustion and confusion. And for a second, Jack saw something hauntingly human in them: grief. Not fear, grief. That look hit him harder than any mortar ever had. He remembered holding a dying friend in Helmand, the man gasping for his mother's name while Jack pressed on his chest to stop the bleeding. That same helpless look. The same acceptance of something you can't undo. "You stayed with him, didn't you?" Jack murmured. His voice was quiet, but steady, the voice of a man talking to ghosts. "You didn't leave your partner. Damn good dog." He leaned closer, brushing away more ice from the shepherd's collar until he found the metal tag. He squinted in the dim light, K9 unit Shadow. He said the name out loud, testing how it felt. "Shadow. All right, that fits." He looked over to the corner of the room where his old duffel bag sat. He pulled it toward him and dug through until he found the first aid kit he hadn't opened in years. The smell of disinfectant brought back too many memories, but his hands worked automatically gauze, antiseptic, tape pressure bandages. He cleaned the wound along the dog's side, muttering under his breath like he used to with the boys overseas. "You're fine. You'll make it. Stay with me." Shadow whimpered once, but when Jack's hand brushed its head, it quieted again, eyes drifting shut. The firelight flickered over its fur, revealing a faint patch of gray along the muzzle. Not young Jack said softly. "You've seen some things too, huh?" When he finally finished, he sat back on the cold floor and exhaled. His body ached, but it was the good kind of pain, the kind that comes from doing something that still mattered, the kind that reminded him he was alive. He reached over gently, lifting the officer's badge he'd taken from the snow earlier. Officer R. Miller. He read again, voice almost reverent. "You and this boy here must have been a hell of a team." He stared at the badge for a long time before setting it beside the dog. The house was silent, except for the crackle of fire and the slow, steady breathing of the shepherd. Outside, the wind was howling again, pushing against the cabin walls like a beast trying to get in. But Jack barely heard it. For the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. He went to the window, looking out into the storm. Somewhere out there, someone had shot that cop. Someone had left him to die. The thought made something old and dangerous stir in Jack's chest, the same fury that had carried him through every ambush overseas. But this wasn't war, and he wasn't a soldier anymore. He gripped the edge of the window frame until his knuckles turned white. "Let it go," he whispered to himself. "This isn't your fight." Then he looked back at Shadow lying by the fire chest, rising and falling with more strength now. Still, he muttered someone should answer for it. He crouched again, reaching out to rest his hand on the dog's back. Shadow's skin twitched under his touch, but the growl that rose in its throat faded into a low sigh. Jack felt the warmth beneath his palm, the pulse of life that refused to quit. He couldn't explain it, but that tiny heartbeat was pulling him back from the edge the same way a radio voice used to pull him back during night patrols. He found himself really talking for the first time in months. "You know, I used to have a partner too," he said quietly. "We made it through 3 tours, thought we were untouchable. He took a round meant for me. I never even saw it coming." His voice caught rough from disuse. "Sometimes I still hear him, in the quiet." Shadow stirred one paw, flexing against the blanket. Jack smiled faintly. "Guess you hear him too, huh, yours?" He poured a little more water into the bowl and tried again, dipping his fingers to let a few drops fall on the dog's tongue. This time, Shadow licked weakly, then swallowed. "That's it, attaboy." Jack couldn't help the small laugh that escaped him. It was a sound that surprised even himself, half relief, half disbelief. He reached for the towel drying the dog's fur, with careful strokes, each motion slower, gentler. "You did good, boy," he said, finally repeating the phrase like a benediction. "Let's get you home." He didn't even realize what he'd said, until the words hung in the warm air, echoing softly against the walls. Home. A word he hadn't used about this cabin in years. He looked around at the fire, the photographs, the empty chair across from him, and something inside shifted, subtle but real. He stood, adding another log to the fire, watching the flames leap higher, painting the shepherd's fur in shades of gold. "Oh, home," he said again, quieter this time, as if convincing himself. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind softening to a low hum. The chimes on Marianne's tree began to stir faintly, a delicate sound carried on the cold air. Jack turned toward the door, listening. It was then that he realized he wasn't the only one who heard something moving out there in the dark. Jack turned from the window, heart pounding in rhythm with the flicker of the fire. The sound outside grew faint again, but something inside him refused to settle. He knelt beside the shepherd, still motionless by the hearth, its sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. The tag on its collar, Shadow, gleamed faintly in the firelight. Jack touched it once, almost like a salute, then stood and pulled his old military duffel from under the bed. He laid out the supplies, bandages, antiseptic, a roll of gauze so old the edges had yellowed. He'd used the same kind once on men bleeding in the sand, except this time the blood wasn't human. He soaked a towel in warm water and pressed it against the wound on Shadow's shoulder. The dog jerked awake with a growl, teeth flashing, eyes wild and terrified. "Easy," Jack murmured, keeping his voice low, steady, the tone that used to calm terrified rookies under fire. The growl deepened. When he reached for the wound again, Shadow snapped, teeth grazing the skin of Jack's wrist, sharp enough to draw a thin line of red. Jack froze, staring at the blood trickling down his arm. He didn't pull away, didn't strike back. Instead, he did what instinct told him. He leaned closer and whispered, "At ease, soldier." The words came out slow, deliberate, not as command, but as memory. The growl broke off mid-breath. The dog's body trembled, confusion flickering in its eyes. It whimpered, head dropping to the blanket, as if the phrase itself carried authority it remembered, but couldn't name. Jack sighed, the old pain in his chest tightening like a knot. He hadn't said those words out loud since his last tour, since that night they lost Corporal Dean, the same man whose jacket now hung heavy on Jack's shoulders. He glanced toward the coat on the hook by the door, still dusted with snow from the storm. Dean had been wearing it the day they hit the roadside bomb, and when they carried him out, Jack had taken it, promising himself he'd keep it warm. He never imagined it would someday keep something else alive. He slid the jacket off the hook, the fabric rough, smelling faintly of smoke and memory. Carefully, he lifted Shadow's head and wrapped the jacket around its body. The dog flinched once, then pressed its nose into the fabric, shivering, but no longer fighting. Jack whispered, "That's it, buddy. You're safe." He went to the radio, turning the dial with cold fingers. Static. Only static. The storm had killed the lines, leaving him sealed off from the world. He tapped the transmitter anyway, more out of habit than hope. "Ranger Station, this is Jack Dawson at Black Pine Ridge. I've got an injured K-9 officer, repeat injured K-9 officer." Nothing. Just the hiss of wind on every channel. Jack let the receiver drop, staring at it for a long moment before muttering, "Figures." He turned back to their fire. The room glowed orange, the only island of light in an ocean of white outside. He poured a bit of water into a pan, heated it on the stove, then mixed in a splash of broth he'd been saving. The smell filled the cabin, simple, comforting, human. When it was warm enough, he dipped his fingers in, bringing drops to the dog's muzzle. "Come on, Shadow. You gotta fight a little." The tongue flicked weakly, then again. Jack smiled, something small, but real. He tried another spoonful, and this time Shadow swallowed. "That's my guy." The words came easier than expected, the same tone he used to coax the scared, the broken, the ones who needed something to hold on to. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside time slowed. Jack sat on the floor back against the wall, watching the dog breathe. Each rise and fall of its chest steadied something in him. His own breathing matched it, unconsciously sinking. He found himself speaking quietly into the room, not sure if he was talking to the dog or to himself. "You know," he said, "I thought I was done with this, with saving things. After Dean, after the war, after Marianne." His voice faltered, the names catching on his tongue like broken glass. "But here you are, dragging me back out into the damn snow again." The shepherd stirred ears, twitching eyes, half opening, as if it understood the confession. Jack chuckled softly, the sound brittle. He leaned forward, adjusting the jacket tighter around Shadow. "That coat belonged to a good man," he said, voice softer now. "He would have liked you. Guess it's still doing its job, keeping a soldier warm." The fire popped sparks rising up the chimney, and for a moment Jack could almost imagine Dean's grin, the way he used to say, "You can't save the world, Jack. Just one at a time." He looked at Shadow again and whispered, "One at a time, huh?" Outside, the wind screamed, shaking the walls. Jack stoked the fire higher, then pulled his chair closer, dragging a blanket over his knees. He reached down, running his hand through the dog's fur. It was coarse-tangled, but still warm under his palm. The dog gave a faint sigh and shifted, pressing its head against Jack's leg. The contact was light, but it undid him completely. His throat tightened, eyes burning with something he hadn't felt in years' connection, No medals, no orders, no battlefield could have prepared him for this tiny gesture of trust from a creature that had every reason to hate the world. He whispered, "You're not alone, Shadow. Not tonight." The clock ticked quietly, marking time between two heartbeats. The storm went on relentless, but it didn't matter anymore. Jack leaned back in the chair, exhaustion catching up to him. His eyelids grew heavy, the rhythmic breathing beside him like a lullaby. Somewhere in the half-dreaming silence, he thought he heard another sound, a faint, contented exhale that wasn't his own. He opened one eye, just enough to see Shadow curled close to the fire, nose buried against the jacket, the steady rise and fall of its chest, almost in sync with his. Two soldiers, one human, one canine, sharing warmth in the middle of nowhere, each keeping the other alive in ways neither could understand. Jack whispered without thinking, "Good night, soldier," and the words drifted into the crackling firelight as the snow outside continued to fall, erasing all tracks from the world beyond the cabin walls. Morning came slowly, a thin gray light seeping through the frost-lined window, cutting across the small cabin like a quiet promise. Jack woke to the sound of his own heartbeat and the faint rhythm of breathing beside him. For a moment he didn't remember where he was, or why his leg felt heavy. Then he looked down and saw Shadow curled tight against him, head resting on his boot, the old army jacket still draped over its body like a blanket. The fire had burned down to embers, but warmth still lingered thick and soft as breath. Jack shifted carefully, afraid to wake the dog. He studied its face, the dark fur streaked with silver, the small scar above the right eye, the twitch of one ear every time the wind hit the cabin walls. The tag on its collar glinted in the light. He reached down and turned it over. The letters were stamped deep Shadow Montana State K9ID 742. Jack whispered the name again, quieter this time. Shadow. The dog stirred ears flicking, as if recognizing itself in that voice. He stood slowly, joints cracking, every muscle reminding him he wasn't 30 anymore. He poured water into a pot, the clink of metal filling the quiet. Outside, the storm had passed. The air was sharp, the sky a pale blue streaked with white clouds. He could see the line of trees clearly now, branches heavy with snow. The world had gone still again, but not empty, more like it was holding its breath. Jack turned on the small transistor radio on the counter, half hoping the signal had come back. At first, there was only static, but then a thin, wavering voice came through, reading the morning bulletin. He leaned in, listening. State authorities continue to search for Officer Raymond Miller and his K9 partner, following a suspected poaching incident in the Black Pine Ridge area. Officials confirmed that one body has been recovered. Jack froze the coffee tin halfway to the stove. And the missing K9 is presumed dead after the blizzard. He turned the volume down slowly, eyes drifting toward the animal still sleeping on the rug. Presumed dead. The words hit him in a way he didn't expect. It wasn't just about survival. It was about defiance. This creature, broken and battered, had crawled through a storm and found its way back to life. And now it was here in his cabin, breathing proof that maybe not everything lost stayed lost. Jack knelt beside it again, tracing the letters on the tag with his thumb. "You're not supposed to be here, are you?" he murmured. "Guess neither am I." Shadow opened one eye, watching him. Jack almost smiled. "Well," he said, "I suppose we're both AWOL then." He stood again, poured hot water into a cup, and sat down in the old armchair by the window. He added a bit of sugar, something Marianne used to tease him about, saying coffee wasn't supposed to taste like candy. The thought made his throat tighten. It had been almost 3 years, but mornings still felt wrong without her humming in the kitchen. He stared out at the snow until it blurred, until memory replaced the view, sunlight on her hair, her hands planting wildflowers outside the porch, the smell of fresh bread. He turned the radio knob again, needing something to fill the silence before it swallowed him whole. Static crackled, then music broke through the opening chords of Take Me Home Country Roads. His breath caught. It had played at her funeral, the one song she said made her feel safe. Jack reached to turn it off, but stopped. He let it play the melody, floating through the small room like a ghost. Shadow stirred. The dog lifted its head, blinking, then pushed itself upright. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. Shadow stood stretched stiffly, then walked toward him, each step hesitant but sure. When it reached him, it looked up, eyes deep and unreadable. Jack whispered, "Hey, buddy," but Shadow didn't need words. It simply laid its head on his knee, the weight solid grounding. The firelight flickered across its fur. Jack felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked tight since the day Marianne's heart stopped beating. The song swelled softly from the radio, John Denver's voice. "Warm and aching country roads take me home to the place I belong." Jack let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He brushed his hand through Shadow's fur, the motion slow, rhythmic, almost reverent. "You don't even know what that song means," he said quietly, "but you feel it, don't you?" Shadow's tail gave one small thump against the floor, and Jack almost laughed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He felt tears prick the back of his eyes hot against the cold morning air. He blinked them away, staring at the far wall where Marianne's picture hung dust gathering on the frame. "You'd like him," Jack said under his breath. "He's stubborn, loyal, doesn't know when to quit." Shadow lifted its head slightly, following his gaze toward the photo, then looked back at him. The dog tilted its head, ears twitching, as if listening to the music, and then with a small sigh, it rested its chin back on his knee. Jack swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the only heartbeat in the room. The song played on the chorus, echoing through the cabin's wooden ribs, filling the spaces grief had carved out. Outside, sunlight began to melt the icicles hanging from the roof droplets, tapping softly against the window pane, like distant applause. When the final chords faded, the radio slipped back to static, and Jack didn't move. He sat there, one hand still resting on the dog's back, the other gripping the edge of his mug. "Guess we both found shelter in the same storm," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched again at the sound of his voice. Jack smiled faintly, leaning back, the creak of the chair blending with the sigh of the wind outside. Somewhere deep in the trees, a raven called the sound sharp and lonely. Shadow lifted its head and answered with a low bark, short and sure, as if to say, "I'm here." Jack's chest tightened. He reached for the radio again, twisting the knob, chasing another song, another fragment of the world beyond his walls. The signal crackled, shifted, and then just for a moment he thought he heard something else break through the static, a sound that wasn't music at all, but something closer to a voice calling through the cold distance. He turned the dial higher, listening. The day began with sunlight spilling through the cracks in the wooden shutters, streaking across the cabin like thin ribbons of gold. For the first time in years, Jack didn't wake to silence or nightmares. He woke to the sound of paws padding across the floor and the low rumble of a tail thumping lazily against the wood. Shadow was already awake, sitting near the door, ears alert, eyes following every movement Jack made. There was something soldier-like in the way he waited, rigid, focused, patient. Jack smiled faintly. "You're up early, huh? Guess discipline doesn't fade easy." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down by the window, watching the snow melt off the pine branches. The world outside was clean again, innocent in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. He glanced at Shadow. "Let's see what you remember, soldier." The words came naturally, the same tone he used years ago with his unit. Firm, measured, gentle, but unyielding. He stood mug still in hand and said, "Sit." Shadow hesitated for half a second, then lowered his haunches, obediently, eyes locked on Jack's. "Stay." The tail froze mid-wag. "Watch." The ears perked forward, every muscle poised for command. Jack chuckled, an honest, unguarded sound that startled him with how foreign it felt. The laugh echoed off the walls like something sacred, something that didn't belong to this cabin of ghosts. "Good boy," he said quietly, crouching to ruffle the dog's neck. Shadow pressed against his hand, warm and alive, and Jack felt something unfurl inside him, a small, fragile thread of joy that he hadn't dared to feel since before the war. He spent the rest of the morning working with Shadow in the clearing behind the cabin. The snow was crusted hard from the night cold crunching under his boots. He tossed a stick, and Shadow darted after it with effortless precision, muscles rippling beneath the thick fur. When he returned, dropping it proudly at Jack's feet, Jack found himself grinning. "You still got it, partner." The word partner slipped out before he could stop it, and for a moment the air felt heavier. The last partner he'd had was buried in a desert half a world away. He shook the thought off and clapped Shadow's shoulder. "You're better trained than most men I've known." By midday, the quiet peace was broken by the crunch of tires on snow outside the cabin. Jack's chest tightened immediately. He wasn't expecting anyone. He looked through the window and saw a white pickup truck with the Montana State seal on the side. A man in uniform stepped out tall, broad-shouldered, his badge gleaming under the winter sun. Sheriff Tom Landry. Jack hadn't seen him in years, not since Marianne's funeral. Landry had been kind, then respectful. Now, as he walked toward the porch, his expression was all business. Jack opened the door before the sheriff could knock. "Morning, Tom," Jack said evenly. "What brings you up this far?" Landry took off his hat, snow dusting his shoulders. "Morning, Jack. Sorry to drop in unannounced, but we need to talk." His tone was courteous but clipped. His gaze flicked past Jack's shoulder and landed on Shadow, who stood just behind him, tail low, eyes cautious. Landry's face softened for a second, then hardened again. "That's him, isn't it? The K-9 from the Miller case." Jack didn't answer right away. "I found him in the storm," he said finally. "Half dead. There wasn't time to think about ownership. I understand," Landry said, his voice heavy with something like regret. "You did the right thing bringing him in, Jack. But I'm afraid the dog is state property. K-9 Unit 742, he belongs to Montana State Police. I'm here to take him back." The words hit like a bullet. Jack's jaw clenched. "Belongs," he repeated. "That dog crawled through a blizzard after his handler was killed. He doesn't belong to anyone anymore. He earned his freedom." Landry sighed, running a gloved hand over his face. "Look, I get it. You bond with something that close to death it feels like fate. But this isn't a stray Jack. It's a trained law enforcement animal. There are protocols. He'll be sent to the state facility, evaluated, maybe reassigned." "Maybe reassigned," Jack echoed bitterly. "And if he's not fit for duty," Landry hesitated. "You know what happens." Jack did. He didn't need to hear it. He'd seen too many good soldiers, men and dogs, retired like broken tools. His chest tightened, anger simmering beneath the calm surface. "He's not a weapon, Tom. He's a survivor." "I'm not arguing that," Landry said quietly. "But the law is the law. If you keep him, it's considered possession of state property." "That's a felony, Jack. You could lose your pension, your benefits, hell. They could even press charges." The sheriff's voice softened. "You've had a rough few years. I don't want to see you go through more trouble. Just let me take the dog." Jack looked down at Shadow. The shepherd stood perfectly still, ears tilted back, as if sensing the tension. His eyes darted between the two men, uncertain but loyal, waiting for Jack's lead. "You hear that, boy?" Jack said, his voice low. "They say you belong to the state. Not to yourself. Not even to the man you risked your life for." He looked up at Landry, the lines on his face deepening. "You ever lose someone who had your back?" Tom Landry's gaze faltered. "Yeah," he said finally. "I have." "Then you know what this is," Jack said. "This isn't about a dog. This is about what's left when duty's done." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low hum of the wind outside. Finally, Landry exhaled. "I'll give you a couple of days," he said, stepping back towards the door. "Get your head straight, but I'll have to file the report. They'll come for him soon, Jack. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jack didn't answer. He just nodded once, curtly. Landry hesitated at the threshold, eyes lingering on Shadow. "He's a good dog," he said softly. Then he left. The sound of the truck fading down the mountain road felt like the world closing in again. Jack stood there staring at the empty doorway, fists clenched at his sides. Shadow walked up beside him and pressed its head gently against his thigh. Jack's hand fell automatically to the dog's neck, fingers tangling in the thick fur. "They think they can just take you," he murmured. "But they don't know what we've been through, do they?" Shadow didn't move, just looked up at him with steady, trusting eyes. Jack swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The law said one thing. His heart said another. He'd spent a lifetime following orders, doing what was right on paper. But now, staring into those eyes that carried the memory of another fallen soldier, Jack Dawson realized that sometimes being right wasn't the same as being human. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the trees, carrying with it a sound that felt almost like a question. The day they came for Shadow, the sky was the color of lead, heavy and unrelenting. Jack stood on the porch as two state officers stepped out of a dark SUV, their boots crunching the frost, their collars pulled high against the mountain wind. The younger one avoided Jack's eyes. The older one, gray-haired and steady, nodded with a kind of grim sympathy. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "we've got orders to collect the K-9 from this location." Jack didn't move. Behind him, Shadow stood in the doorway, ears pinned back, sensing what was coming. "He's not just a K-9, Jack said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "He's been through hell and back." The officer sighed. "Sir, we don't have a choice. Neither do you." The words hit like a blow. Jack stepped aside, unwilling but powerless, watching as they approached the dog. Shadow growled low, a sound deep and wounded more heartbreak than threat. "Easy boy," Jack whispered, crouching to meet his eyes one last time. "At ease, soldier." The shepherd's tail gave a faint twitch, confusion flickering across his face. When the leash slipped over his neck, he didn't fight, at least not at first. But when they began to pull him away, something broke. The bark that erupted wasn't rage, it was grief, a raw, gut-deep sound that echoed through the valley and sliced clean through Jack's chest. Shadow Jack called out, his voice cracking. The dog dug his paws into the snow body, straining against the lead, trying to get back to him. The officers wrestled him toward the vehicle, and even as the door shut, Shadow's eyes never left Jack's. The last thing Jack saw was the silhouette of the dog in the back seat, pressing against the glass mouth open in a silent howl as the SUV disappeared down the road. That night the wind carried a different kind of sound through the mountains. It wasn't the usual whistle of pine branches or the creak of frozen bark. It was a cry long, haunting, heart-shattering. Shadow's howl rolled down from somewhere far, then closer, then far again, echoing through the snow. Jack sat by the window lights off, staring into the blackness beyond the glass. He couldn't see the dog, but he could hear him calling out for something that didn't exist anymore. Each cry was an accusation, a confession, a wound. He pressed his hand to the cold window pane, whispering to no one. "I'm sorry, boy." He'd told himself it was the right thing to do, that maybe the state would care for him, feed him, train him again, but deep down he knew the truth. The world didn't know what to do with broken soldiers. Jack poured himself a drink. He didn't want the whiskey burning on its way down, offering no warmth. Outside, the howls grew weaker, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse. He leaned back in his chair, the fire dying low, his mind replaying the moment Shadow was pulled away, those eyes wet and furious, filled with betrayal. He'd seen that same look once before in the mirror the day he signed his discharge papers, the day the Army told him his service was complete. The same quiet, helpless rage of a man left behind by the only world that understood him. By dawn, the storm had moved on, leaving the mountains glistening under a pale sun. Jack hadn't slept. His coffee had gone cold again, untouched. He sat staring at the empty chair across from him, where Shadow used to rest his head. The silence pressed in. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. He thought about calling the sheriff, asking how the dog was adjusting, but the thought twisted something in his gut. He didn't want to hear the truth. He didn't want to know if Shadow had stopped howling. The wind shifted outside, faint at first, then harder. He rose to add wood to the stove, and that was when he heard a sound at the door. A soft, uneven thud. Then another. Then the faintest whimper. He froze, the log slipping from his hands. For a heartbeat, he thought he was imagining it. Then came the scrape of claws on wood, weak and desperate. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs as he crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled open the door. Shadow stood there, trembling, soaked to the bone mud splattered across his chest and paws. His right foreleg was torn open, bleeding where the ice had bitten deep. He looked half wild, half broken, but his eyes, those steady amber eyes, still burned with the same desperate loyalty. For a second, Jack couldn't move. He just stared disbelief and awe, crashing into him all at once. "Jesus, Shadow," he breathed. The dog swayed, exhausted, his sides heaving. Then he took one step forward, then another, collapsing against Jack's legs with a soft, strangled whine. Jack dropped to his knees, gathering the dog's head into his arms, feeling the shivers running through him. "You came back," he whispered, voice breaking. "You crazy son of a gun, you came back." He could smell the earth and blood and cold on the dog's fur, the scent of miles run through darkness and pain. He pulled Shadow inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The dog staggered toward the fire and sank down on the rug, too tired to lift his head. Jack grabbed a towel, wrapping it around him, drying him as best he could. 10 miles. He muttered, disbelief tangled with pride. "You ran 10 damn miles through the cold for this." Shadow's eyes half opened, unfocused but calm. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "You don't even know you broke the law," he said softly. "You just knew where home was." The word hung in the air, heavy and trembling. Home. He cleaned the wound, his hand steady despite the ache in his chest. The dog flinched once but didn't resist. When he finished, Jack sat back, staring at the creature lying before him, scarred, bruised, but unbroken. He thought about what Sheriff Landry would say if he knew about the trouble that would surely follow, about the headlines and paperwork and punishment. But none of it mattered. Not now. Shadow's tail moved weakly, once brushing against Jack's boot, a small gesture that said everything words couldn't. Jack ran a hand down his back, whispering, "You're safe, soldier. You're home." The fire crackled, the only sound in the cabin. Outside, the snow began to fall again, light this time, almost gentle. The world was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that hurt. It was the quiet of 2 survivors breathing the same air, their wounds stitched together by loyalty stronger than any law. Jack leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes, and for the first time since the war, he felt something close to peace. But deep down he knew it couldn't last, not in a world that punished devotion, not when loyalty itself had become a crime. By the next morning, the radio was already carrying the news. Montana State Police confirmed that K9 Shadow, missing from the Cascade Training Facility, has escaped. Residents are advised to report any sightings. The announcer's voice was calm, professional, but to Jack it sounded like a threat aimed straight at his cabin. He turned off the radio and leaned his hands on the counter, the silence pressing down like the weight of the mountains outside. Behind him, Shadow stood near the door, limping slightly, but alert ears twitching at every sound. Jack turned, meeting the dog's gaze. "They're coming for you," he said quietly. "They won't stop this time." The dog tilted its head, not understanding the words, but sensing the gravity in Jack's tone. He knelt, running a rough hand through Shadow's fur. "All right, soldier. If we're gonna do this, we do it smart." He moved fast the way he used to on recon missions. The old instincts clicked back into place like a weapon being reassembled. He opened the trap door beneath the rug near the fireplace, a root cellar he hadn't used in years. The air below was damp and cold, thick with the scent of earth and time. "You'll be safe down there for a while," he murmured, coaxing Shadow toward the opening. The dog hesitated, glancing between Jack and the dark hole. "Go on," Jack urged. "It's just for now." When Shadow finally descended, Jack followed with a lantern, checking the space old crates canned goods blankets he'd stored decades ago. It wasn't much, but it would work. He filled a bowl with water, left some food, then reached into a box marked surplus and pulled out a small bundle of cloth and charcoal. He tore a strip of cloth, rubbed it with ash, then pressed it against Shadow's fur, masking the scent. "Lesson 1, he whispered. Hide your smell. They'll track you if you don't." Shadow sniffed his hand as if recognizing the seriousness of the lesson. Jack smiled faintly. "You're learning faster than half my recruits ever did." Over the next few days, Jack lived like a fugitive in his own home. Every noise outside made him freeze. Every truck engine in the distance turned his stomach cold. He stopped chopping wood in daylight, stopped walking into town. He taught Shadow to stay silent when the sound of tires rolled up the road. Once, when a pair of deputies came to check in, Shadow stayed hidden in the cellar for 6 straight hours, not making a single sound. Jack sat by the fire, answering questions with the calm of a man who had learned how to lie when the truth was lethal. "No, haven't seen him since they took him," he said, eyes steady. "Probably halfway to Canada by now." The younger deputy glanced toward the window, unconvinced, but the older one shrugged. "He's just a dog," he said. Jack forced a smile. You'd be surprised what just a dog can do. That night after they left, Jack descended into the cellar. Shadow lifted his head from the blankets, tail wagging once faintly. Jack crouched beside him. "They're getting close," he whispered. "We'll have to move soon." The dog tilted its head again, ears flicking. Jack felt a strange pride rise in his chest. The old soldier in him was alive again, strategic, focused, precise. But this time the mission wasn't about survival. It was about loyalty, about keeping one promise in a world that had taken too many from him. 3 nights later, Shadow woke first. The low rumble in his throat jolted Jack out of a light, uneasy sleep. "What is it?" Jack whispered, reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. The dog stood by the window, ears sharp, body tense, staring towards the tree line. Jack followed his gaze and saw them flashlights moving through the forest, slow and deliberate. Too quiet for police, too careless for hikers. He crouched low, heart thudding, watching the shapes weave between the trees. There were 3 of them. Maybe 4 rifles slung low, the faint metallic click of a safety being checked, carrying across the still night air. Jack's gut tightened. "Poachers," he muttered. The word tasted like rust. Shadow growled softly, muscles coiled, waiting for command. Jack laid a hand on his neck. Easy. He could call the sheriff, report the movement, let the system handle it. But the system had already tried to cage the very creature standing beside him. He looked at the dog, then at the phone on the wall. If he called, they'd come and they'd take Shadow again. He'd lose him for good this time. But if he didn't, someone else could end up like Officer Miller. The decision tore through him like shrapnel. He'd spent a lifetime following orders, believing in the chain of command, believing law and right were the same thing. But sitting here, staring into the eyes of the animal who had risked everything to return to him, that belief felt small and hollow. "What do I do, buddy?" he whispered. Shadow's eyes caught the glow of the firelight, amber and knowing. He stepped toward the window, nose twitching, tail stiff. He'd caught the scent of blood before Jack even realized it, fresh, sharp human. Jack's pulse quickened. The men were dragging something heavy through the snow, a carcass. Maybe, though from this distance he couldn't tell if it was animal or not. He raised the rifle halfway, then lowered it. He couldn't shoot. Not yet. Shadow pressed against his leg, letting out a low whine, almost urging him to act. Jack shook his head. "Not yet," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The flashlight beams moved closer to the edge of his property, their laughter muffled but distinct. He could hear one of them say, "Easy pickings out here, no rangers this far up." Shadow's hackles rose, a low growl rolling from his chest like thunder. Jack could feel the sound vibrating against his skin. He placed his hand on the dog's shoulder again. "Stay," he ordered. The dog froze but kept his eyes locked on the tree line. Jack's mind raced. If he called Landry, they'd catch the poachers, maybe even close the case on Officer Miller's death. But they'd find Shadow, too. They'd take him back in chains or worse. The phone on the wall seemed to hum in the silence, as if mocking him. Jack stood, his heart a storm inside his chest. "Damn it," he whispered, pacing once, twice. Shadow's gaze followed him, patient, waiting. Outside, the poachers' voices grew louder, careless, confident. The sound of a gunbolt sliding home cut through the night air. Jack froze. Shadow growled again, deeper this time, low and certain. It was no longer a warning. It was instinct, the same one that had driven him through the storm back to this cabin. Jack looked down at him, meeting those fierce, unwavering eyes. "I know, buddy," he murmured, voice tight. "I know." He moved toward the window, his hand hovering near the rifle, once more torn between duty and devotion. Outside, the flashlights stopped moving. The men had seen something or someone. Jack's breath caught as he leaned closer to the glass. The world outside had gone still again, but the kind of stillness that comes before everything breaks. The forest was silent, but alive, holding its breath under the weight of snow and danger. Jack crouched behind a fallen pine, his breath misting in the cold air, the rifle steady in his hands. Shadow was beside him, motionless eyes locked on the clearing ahead where the poachers moved 3 men, their laughter low, and cruel rifles slung carelessly across their backs. The moon broke through the clouds, silvering the trees, and for a moment Jack could see them clearly. One carried a bloodied sack, another dragged a freshly killed elk by its antlers. He felt his stomach twist. Officer Miller had died trying to stop men like these, and now, by some strange symmetry of fate, Jack was standing in the same snow, holding the same kind of rifle, with the same kind of soldier by his side. He touched Shadow's shoulder lightly, a silent signal. The dog's muscles tensed under his hand, every nerve alive, waiting for command. "Easy," Jack whispered. Not yet. He knew he couldn't call for backup. By the time the sheriff's men reached the ridge, the poachers would vanish into the timber. This was on him. The thought didn't scare him. It steadied him. Maybe it was the soldier in him. Maybe it was something deeper, but this felt like the moment everything in his life had been leading toward. Shadow's breath came out in short, quiet bursts, his body, low tail stiff, ready. Jack exhaled, slowly raised the rifle, and aimed for the leader's weapon, not his chest. "We do this clean," he murmured. "We end it right." The shot cracked through the cold like lightning splitting stone. The rifle stock kicked against his shoulder. The leader's gun flew from his hands, spinning into the snow. Chaos erupted. "Shit! Who's out there?" one of them shouted. Another fired blindly into the trees. Jack ducked behind the log snow exploding around him as bullets chewed through bark. "Stay," he hissed, but Shadow was already moving. The shepherd darted low and fast, a streak of dark against the white, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. Shadow Jack hissed, but the name was lost in the wind and gunfire. He caught a glimpse of movement, a blur lunging from the tree line, and then the sound of a man screaming. Shadow hit one of the poachers square in the chest, knocking him backward into the snow, the rifle tumbling from his hands. The man kicked wildly, shouting, but Shadow's growl cut through it, raw and primal. Jack moved, then circling the clearing, adrenaline firing through his veins. He fired another shot into the air, forcing the others to scatter. "Drop it," he shouted, his voice carrying the command of a man who'd given orders under fire before. One of them hesitated, hand trembling over the trigger. "Drop it, damn it," Jack barked again. The man did. For a second, it seemed like it might end there, quiet and clean. But then from behind the fallen log, the last poacher rose, face twisted, gun raised. Jack didn't even have time to react before the shot rang out. The world slowed. Jack heard the crack of the rifle, felt the rush of air as the bullet tore through the space between them, and then he saw Shadow move. The dog launched from the side straight into the path of the bullet, the sound of impact dull and terrible. Shadow hit the ground hard, snow blooming red beneath him. Jack's heart stopped. "No," he roared, firing twice, clean controlled, sending the shooter's rifle spinning from his grasp. He ran to Shadow, dropping to his knees beside him. The shepherd lay still, chest rising, shallowly, eyes half closed. "God, no. No, no, no," Jack muttered, hands pressing against the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, warm and unreal in the cold air. Shadow looked up at him, eyes calm, unafraid. Jack felt something in his chest crack wide open. "Why'd you do that, huh?" he whispered, voice shaking. "You stupid, brave bastard." The dog blinked slowly as if answering. "Because that's what soldiers do." The forest fell silent again, broken only by Jack's ragged breathing. Then came the distant sound of engines, sirens, faint but growing closer. Someone must have heard the gunfire. He didn't care. He just kept his hand on the dog's chest, whispering nonsense the same way he had whispered to dying men in sand and dust years ago. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay." The lights appeared through the trees, flashlights, red strobes cutting through the snow. Sheriff Landry's voice called out, "Jack, you out here?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. Landry and his deputies reached the clearing and froze at the sight before them. 3 poachers disarmed and bleeding in the snow. One dog lying motionless in the center, and Jack Dawson kneeling beside him, his hands covered in blood that wasn't his own. Jesus Christ! Landry breathed, rushing forward. What the hell happened? Jack didn't look up. They were the ones, he said quietly. The ones who killed Officer Miller. Shadow found them. Landry stared, jaw tightening. He looked down at the dog, then at Jack, and something in his expression softened. He saved your life, didn't he? Jack nodded, unable to speak. His throat burned, his vision blurred. Landry knelt beside them, hand resting on the shepherd's side. "He's still breathing," he said quickly. "Get the medkit." One of the deputies ran back to the truck. Landry looked at Jack. "You know they're going to ask questions about this, about why you had him here." Jack met his gaze, eyes steady despite the tears. "Let them ask." Landry studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slow, solemn nod, the kind of nod that passes between men who've both buried too many brothers. "Seems like he's already chosen his new handler," he said quietly. Jack looked down at Shadow, his hand still on the dog's fur, feeling the faint, stubborn rhythm of life under his palm. "Yeah," he whispered, voice trembling. "I think he did." The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, covering the blood, the tracks, the wreckage. The deputies moved in silence, securing the scene, hauling the poachers away. Landry stood over Jack for a moment longer, hat in his hands, eyes shadowed with something like respect. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. In that still frozen clearing surrounded by echoes of violence and loyalty, no one did. The only sound was the fire of the flares hissing in the distance, and the soft, rhythmic breath of a wounded soldier who had finally found his place beside another. Spring came late to the Montana mountains, the kind of reluctant thaw that made rivers swell and trees drip for weeks before the green finally returned. The snow was almost gone when Jack got the letter. It arrived in a plain brown envelope government seal, in the corner the words, "Montana State Police Department," stamped across the top. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. He'd been waiting for this, dreading it, since the night of the shooting. Still, he unfolded the letter slowly, reading each word, as if they might rearrange themselves into mercy. They didn't. Per official review. K. 9742. Shadow is to be returned to state custody for reassignment and behavioral assessment. This is a matter of safety and legal compliance. He sat back in his chair, staring at the paper until the ink blurred. "Safety," he muttered. Whose Shadow was lying by the porch, healed now stronger. The scar on his side had faded into a thin line beneath his fur, but every time Jack saw it, his throat tightened. He walked outside, the letter still in his hand. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and rain. Shadow lifted his head tail, thumping once against the floorboards. "They want you back," Jack said quietly. The dog's ears perked, eyes curious. Jack crouched, holding the paper loosely. "They say it's for your own good. You'll get food, a warm kennel, maybe even another handler." He swallowed hard. "Hell, maybe that's what you deserve." Shadow tilted his head, that same gentle confusion that always made Jack's chest ache. He reached out, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "But it's not what I want." The next morning the transport van came. Sheriff Landry stepped out again, his hat low against the morning sun. He didn't look pleased to be there. "I pushed back as long as I could," he said. "They're citing liability. After what happened, the state wants to make sure the dog's fit for duty." Jack nodded, jaw tight. "Duty," he echoed. "That's the word that never lets go." Landry sighed. "I'm sorry, Jack." Behind him, 2 handlers waited by the van. One of them held a new leash, the kind used for K-9 training. Shadow stood by Jack's side, sensing the tension, tail-still eyes flicking between the men. Jack knelt down beside him, his hand resting over the tag on the collar, K-9742. "Shadow. You did good, soldier," he whispered, voice thick. "You did better than most men I ever knew." He paused, his breath shaking. "Go do your duty. You've earned it." Shadow didn't move. Jack gave a soft command, one he hadn't used in months. Forward. The shepherd hesitated, then stepped toward the handlers. When they clipped the leash, he turned his head, once eyes locking with Jack's. It wasn't confusion or fear, this time it was understanding. A farewell without words. Jack stood there until the van disappeared around the bend, the dust settling in the morning light like a ghost. That night the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. Jack poured himself a drink, but it didn't burn the way it used to. He sat at the kitchen table, the old journal open in front of him, the one Marianne had given him after the war, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. He picked up a pen and wrote slowly, his handwriting uneven, the ink blotting near the edge of the page. If I don't wake up one day, tell them I was loved. Tell them I was seen. Tell them I was saved, not by God, not by man, but by a dog. He stopped there, the pen hovering over the paper. Then he signed it, simply. JD? He closed the book, set it beside the lamp, and stared into the fire until the logs collapsed into embers. Days turned into weeks. The forest bloomed, the rivers thawed, and the mountains came alive again. Jack worked in his small workshop behind the cabin, fixing what little there was to fix, tinkering with old radios and wood carvings. Sometimes when the wind came from the east, he could almost imagine hearing shadows bark in the distance. He'd pause, listening, but the sound would fade into nothing. You're hearing ghosts again, he'd tell himself, but it didn't stop him from leaving the back gate open just in case. Then came the morning everything changed. It was late June, already warm sunlight spilling over the porch steps. Jack had been in the workshop since dawn, sanding a piece of pine for a new chair. He was humming softly some half-forgotten tune from the barracks when his hand went numb. The tool slipped. Pain shot through his chest, sharp and merciless. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. The world tilted, spinning in silence. He collapsed against the workbench, gasping, one arm refusing to move. Not yet, he rasped, but his voice barely reached his own ears. His vision dimmed, the edges closing in like dusk. He didn't remember hitting the floor. Time dissolved into flashes, his wife's face, his platoon, the sound of shadows bark. He tried to call for help, but only a strangled breath came out. He was alone again in the same way he'd been when the war ended, when Marianne died, when Shadow left. Except this time he didn't feel angry, just tired. 3 days later, a team from the rescue unit found him alive, but unconscious, barely breathing. Sheriff Landry led the group, and when they reached the workshop, they stopped dead in the doorway. Because standing over Jack's body, muddy, panting eyes, wild and desperate, was Shadow. The shepherd had torn through 10 miles of wilderness, found the old trail to the cabin, and somehow led the rescuers straight to him. His paws were bleeding, his fur matted with mud, but his tail wagged weakly as Landry knelt beside him. "Son of a bitch," the sheriff whispered. "You really did come home." They lifted Jack onto the stretcher oxygen mask, in place the medics moving quickly. Shadow limped after them, refusing to stay behind. When they reached the ambulance, the dog jumped in without waiting for permission, planting himself beside Jack's side head, resting on his arm. One of the medics moved to push him away, but Landry shook his head. "Leave him," he said quietly. "He's earned it." As the doors closed and the siren began to wail, Landry glanced down at the muddy tracks in the snowmelt, the same tracks that led from the mountains through the river and back to this cabin. A perfect circle carved by loyalty loss, and something stronger than either love that refused to die, no matter how many times it was told to let go. When Jack opened his eyes in the hospital, the world came back slowly, like a radio tuning through static until the signal found its way home. The room smelled of antiseptic and pine cleaner, the kind that clung to every rural clinic in Montana. Machines beeped softly beside him, steady, unhurried. For a moment, he didn't remember how he'd gotten there. Then he saw the Shadow at the foot of his bed, motionless, familiar breathing in rhythm with the sound of his heart monitor. Shadow. The German shepherd lay curled up on the floor, head resting on his paws, fur patched where the rescue had torn through snow and thorn. His eyes flicked open the second Jack shifted. "Hey, buddy." Jack whispered, his voice rough with weakness. "You found me again." The dog thumped his tail once slow and satisfied, as if to say, of course. Sheriff Landry stood in the doorway, hat in hand. You owe him, he said quietly. He wouldn't stop until he got us up that mountain. Hell, he almost dragged my medic by the sleeve. Jack smiled faintly. That's Shadow. Doesn't know how to quit. Landry stepped closer, the lines in his face softened by something rare respect. The department's been talking. Officially, he's retired from the K-9 unit. Unofficially. He paused, glancing down at the shepherd. They're willing to make an exception. Call it a veteran companion program, or some bureaucratic phrase that means you get to keep him. He earned that, I think. Jack's throat tightened. We both did. 3 months later, the snow had returned to the mountains, blanketing the world in a peace that only silence could give. Jack moved slower now, his right side stiff from the stroke, but he'd learned to live with the limp. Shadow never left his side. The two of them became a familiar sight along the ridges, one man, one dog walking through the pines like ghosts who had made peace with the world. They hunted small game repaired. The old fence sat on the porch in the evenings with the firelight flickering against the glass. Jack would sip coffee. Shadow would rest his head on Jack's boot, and neither of them would say a word. They didn't need to. Love had stopped being something you declared. It was something you lived in the quiet hours when no one else was watching. Sometimes Jack caught himself talking to Shadow anyway, about the war, about Marianne, about the weight of loneliness that had once crushed him, until this creature had walked into his life. Funny thing, isn't it, he'd say, staring out at the fading sun. I thought I was saving you that night in the storm. Turns out you were saving me. Shadow would lift his head, ears, twitching eyes, soft and knowing. In those moments, Jack could swear the dog understood every word. The cabin became a sanctuary again. The fire always burned low, the shelves stocked with books he hadn't touched in years. Every morning Jack brewed 2 cups of coffee out of habit, one for himself. One he'd pour into an old tin bowl on the porch, a ritual that made him smile every time. When the local kids from town came by to sell firewood, they'd wave from the road calling, "Hey, Mr. Dawson, how's the hero dog?" Jack would wave back. Shadow standing proud beside him, chest broad and tail wagging like he knew what hero meant. At night, when the wind swept down from the peaks and the world felt small and fragile, Jack would murmur softly. At ease, soldier, and Shadow would curl closer, a living reminder that home wasn't a place, it was a heartbeat that answered yours. Years folded quietly into each other. Jack's hair turned silver, his hands slower, his steps fewer, but his eyes stayed clear. Shadow aged too, muzzle whitening joints, stiff movements gentler. They carried their scars like medals, both earned in battles no one else had seen. One evening, as the sky burned gold and the horizon shimmered with snowlight, Jack stood at the porch railing watching the mountains darken. Shadow was lying at his feet, eyes half-closed, chest rising steady. "You know," Jack said softly, "when I die, I hope it's out here. Not in some sterile room, not under a machine. Just here with this view. With you." Shadow's tail tapped once against the wood, faint but sure. The first snow of winter came early that year. Heavy flakes fell through the pines, soft as feathers. Jack woke to the stillness that only follows a night of snowfall, the kind that muffles the world and makes every sound feel sacred. He brewed his coffee, pulled on his old army coat, and opened the front door. The cold air rushed in, sharp and pure. For a second, everything looked the same. The trees heavy with white, the porch covered in frost. Then he saw him. Shadow lay on the porch, just beyond the door, his body dusted in snow, as if the storm itself had tucked him in. His head rested gently on Jack's folded coat, the one with the faded army patch and the burn mark near the sleeve. His eyes were closed, his breathing still. The world seemed to tilt, not in pain, but in stillness, the kind of silence that carries peace. Jack stepped out slowly, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He knelt beside the dog, one hand trembling as it brushed the frost from Shadow's fur. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, voice catching. "You made it home." His throat tightened, but he smiled small and steady. "At ease, soldier. You did your duty." He stayed there for a long time, snow falling around them, the morning light spilling gold across the porch. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered, casting a warm glow through the window. The journal still sat on the table, open to the last page he had written months ago. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained. If I don't wake up one day, tell them I was loved by a dog. As the camera would pull back, if life were a film, the cabin would shrink into the landscape, the snow drifting down like quiet applause from the heavens. The mountains would glow faintly in the dawn, the wind carrying the faint echo of two heartbeats once aligned. Somewhere a bird called the sound, breaking through the stillness before fading again into peace. And, on that porch beneath the falling snow, one man and one shepherd finally rested two soldiers who had fought their last battle. Two souls who had found what they'd both been searching for all along. Home. If this story moved something in you, the quiet kind of love that doesn't need words, the loyalty that outlives even time, then share it. Hit that like button, subscribe, for more stories about the unbreakable bond between people and their dogs, and tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you the most. Was it when Jack whispered, "At ease, soldier," or when Shadow came home through the storm? Your heart will know the answer.